All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Simplifying Hyper-V Management for VMware Administrators. My name is Ryan Oystetcher. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and at Five9 and also the Managing Editor of MS Cloud Insider. I'm really pleased to be helping to present this presentation today. A lot of VMware administrators are either new to Hyper-V or have been using Hyper-V for a while, but need a little more practice and a little more experience with it. So we're here to kind of tell you the tips in the trade to help you get started. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker. It's Robert Corradini. He's a Microsoft Cloud MVP, and he's experienced in all of the different facets of VMware and Hyper-V, and he's here to kind of tell you about what you need to know to help simplify your Hyper-V management experience. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you, Rob.
Hey, how are you, Ryan? Thanks for having me up. Thanks for having us here today, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about simplifying Hyper-V management for VMware administrators. I'm Rob Corradini. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center. I'm also Director of Product Management here at Five9, and I've also been about 20 years in the field consulting and leading Microsoft practices. So that being said, let's get started. Ryan, you want to talk a little bit about Five9 and what we're about?
Sure, I'd love to. So if you're not familiar with Five9, we are the leading provider of security and management solutions for the Microsoft Cloud. And we provide everything in a nice, neat little package to help simplify your management experience. So if you're used to vCenter, if you're used to vShield, if you're coming over to Hyper-V for the first time, we are going to make it a seamless transition for you. We're going to make it super easy. We have over 1,000 enterprise customers worldwide. Over 100,000 administrators are using our products and services, and as of today, we're managing 5 million plus VMs. So we're really excited to be presenting this to you today because we love when people are moving to Hyper-V because we have something new to talk to them about, and we have something that's going to help make their lives a whole lot easier. So we can kick it to the next slide, Rob. Rob, you may be on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's
all right,
okay.
So
that's how you know that this is a live broadcast, folks.
Exactly, when you have mistakes and demos maybe not working, etc.
Yeah.
So let's talk about our platform and our unified platform and what Five9 really does. And you got to realize in the Microsoft space, when you're doing a lot of these same activities, it's multiple different tools versus Five9. We actually have a very unified platform that really brings that ease of automation, increases performance, and simplifies management. And then we have also security, which protects against cyber attacks. So let's talk about some of those pillars. Migrate. We have the ability to migrate routine heterogeneous clouds like ESX to Hyper-V or Hyper-V to Azure, etc. And those are very important because we don't live in these worlds that we have one cloud or only on-premise. We essentially have heterogeneous worlds, heterogeneous on-premise, V2V with like VMware and Hyper-V, because sometimes there are specific reasons having those workloads on one hypervisor or another. Managing is a great, you want to be able to manage these environments very efficiently. You want RBAC controls, role-based access controls, and you want governance around workloads, and having that application awareness. You want self-provisioning templates. You want the ability to have backup and recovery, and also lifecycle management. And then, the other pillars that are really important is monitoring and securing in your environment. Real-time alerts, performance monitoring, capacity planning. These are all things that are very important to understanding and managing your data center environment, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. And then we're talking about security. Security is probably one of the #1 things that I would say on a data center environment. It's obviously getting very high publicity when something happens or some kind of cyber attack happens. So it's very important to have real-time policy configuration. So when you're actually editing those policies, they actually are happening in real time and not at a delayed, we'll say, deployment. We also have centralized log management. So we're actually aggregating all those logs from different VMs and different architectures into a centralized system, so you can really look at that in a collated one single pane of view glass view. We have threat detection and prevention, so you can look at all that, IDS related activities, intrusion detection and prevention activities. And then we have automated workload prevention, so we understand, what a workload is and understand what application awareness is to an extent. So that being said, those are the pillars we have, and we're going to start diving in deeper now, more into the HyperV best practices, and then we'll redifferentiate. So the agenda today is we're going to start out with HyperV best practices, some of the requirements around HyperV. Then we're going to get into planning, migration, and cleanup. Next, we're going to get into HyperV deployment, how you push these HyperV nodes out, and then how do you bring high availability to these nodes, essentially clusters, configuring the network around HyperV, live migration, which is essentially moving VMs between one node to another node without taking down that particular workload. And then also we're going to talk about templates and libraries. Next, we'll get into HyperV management. We'll talk about bringing a HyperV cluster into production. And then, once it's in production, you really have to start talking about consumption and getting that end users to actually really, consume that HyperV environment. And then we'll talk about monitoring and maintenance. After that, on the agenda, we got HyperV tools. We're going to talk a little bit about SCVMM. We'll talk a little bit about SCOM, these are different approaches for essentially managing your data center. And then we'll also talk about PowerShell, which is probably the toughest way to manage a data center, depending on who you ask. And then we'll talk about 5.9 and where we fill the gaps. So, are we all ready to get started? I guess we are. How about that? Are we, Ryan?
Let's do it to it.
Rock and roll. So, oh my clicker today is being a little bit. All right, here we go. HyperV migration best practices and reducing the complexity with careful planning and the right tools. And I can't emphasize this enough because, especially when you have very mission critical workloads, it's very important that we have the right planning tools. We understand what we're doing, where we're going, essentially. So let's talk a little bit about naming nomenclature, and specifically between VMware and Microsoft, because there's definitely distinct differences in their products and the equivalency of what their products are, etc. So, for example, in the automation scheme, Microsoft's product is called System Center Orchestrator. And VMware, it's vCenter Orchestrator. Service Manager, which is a tool for doing help desking and some other types of, we'll say, front-ending customer service type tool. That's called Service Manager. And in the VMware world, that's vCloud Automation Center. Under protection, we have DPM or Data Protection Manager. vCenter has vSphere Data Protection. Monitoring Operations Manager or System Center or SCOM, which is really what it's referred to. In vCenter, we have Operations Manager Suite. So, as we go along here, you can see the theme. There's definitely a different naming culture between, between VMware and Microsoft, but they're essentially the same type of management or solution that they're doing. As for hypervisor, this is the most common one. HyperV, vSphere. Makes sense. Those are the two different hypervisors that we're talking about today.
And Rob, just as an aside, I'm getting some questions on our end. If we're going to send this out, I know that the terminology as people are transitioning to HyperV is a big thing. So yes, of course, we're going to send out this slide deck either tomorrow, sometime after the presentation.
Awesome. Good idea to look at some of this stuff and understand what product maps over to what. Awesome. So let's talk about requirements on HyperV. So requirements, and this is more around requirements of managing up to 150 hosts. And so minimum requirements are Pentium 4, 2 gigahertz. Obviously, we're in a much bigger world right now where we're doing dual core, quad core processors, which are recommended. Typically, you'd see these Pentium 4s in more of a POC environment. So when you want to check out HyperV before you go full-blown into that environment. Minimum is 4 gigs of RAM because the OS has a certain overhead, and then you have some RAM for the virtual machines, probably 1 or 2. Hard disk space is 2 gigs on the minimum, 4 gigs recommended, and then hard disk space when you're installing a full version of SQL, which is supporting SCVMM. That's 80 gigs to 150 gigs, depending on how the size of your environment, how much you're recording into SQL, etc. If you're, oh, sorry about this slide, but if you're managing more than 150 hosts, the RAM requirements are a little bit different, similar, but a little bit, I would say a little bit higher. You know, you want a dual core, but a 3.6 gigahertz processor. You definitely want that computing power. And it's really about, you know, you also want to maintain a 20% buffer. I always say 20% buffer, but you know, some people are even more conservative and do a 30 or 40% buffer. That way you can ensure, so when you have that, when you're time for that hardware refresh, you know, you have that small buffer to essentially have that time to go figure out what your next storage and virtualization hardware is going to be. And then other requirements are, you know, we want to make sure both sides are on the same subnet. We want to also ensure virtualization is turned on in the system BIOS. By default, 90% of the time, virtualization is turned off.
Hey, and Rob,
Ryan, did you have something?
Yeah. Just a quick aside. You know, help me understand, right? Like in large enterprise environments where there's more than 150 hosts being managed, how does that play into kind of the different complications of running SCVMM and you know, having kind of multi-tenancy in place and so on and so forth?
Sure. So when you're typically running, especially a more than 150 host environment, you're using SCVMM, but there's also another tool called HyperV Manager. And HyperV Manager is a very basic HyperV management tool without really a lot of awareness of clustering, etc. When you manage a HyperV environment with using SCVMM, it's a combination of, you know, HyperV Manager, Failover Cluster Manager, and SCVMM, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. It can be a little cumbersome because there's certain functions you can't do in one where you can do in the other, and sometimes you're, you know, going between 2 different tools. So some of those things can be frustrating versus, you know, where we're getting to is a solution where you want some single pane of glass and you want the ability to be able to, you know, add hosts and add nodes very, you know, at agility without going through a lot of effort. So those are some of the things and pain points, I would say, of managing a Hyper-V environment using traditional tool sets. I think that would answer that question for that gentleman or gentlewoman. All right, let's move on. So additional requirements is, are we going to determine if we're going to use a GUI or are we going to use a non-GUI interface? You know, you have to have expertise in System Center. System Center is not a simple tool. In fact, a lot of administrators are dedicated to some of these tools, especially SCOM, because SCOM has a lot of deep insight, but a lot of complexity to it. Obviously, looking at a non-GUI interface, you know, there's obviously a lot more complexity, you know, and it's a lot around script-based conversions. And again, a lot more complexity than a typical environment needs, especially if you have, you know, if your typical IT environment, you're looking just to get it done very simply. So you have to make those decisions. You know, other requirements, you know, do you, if you want to use a UI other than SCVMM, you can use the UI like 5.9. Now 5.9 has a V2V converter, which allows you essentially to move virtual machines between ESX environments and VMware, Hyper-V environments. Essentially you can pick the VMs. It's a very wizard-based approach. You know, you pick the resources, how you want to map those, like storage, etc., because you're going from VMware storage to Hyper-V storage, which is essentially a different SAN, or HCI solution, storage solution, but it's all wizard based, and it makes it very easy. There's a, it's speed and simplicity, and the margin for error is very, very low. So,
hey, and Rob,
yeah.
Maybe what we do just real quick is, since we have so many people on the line right now, we've got a quick poll question. We're going to ask,
Sure.
what are you currently using for Hyper-V management? So if you could just log into your screen, tell us, what you're using. We've got quite a few folks over here. Got a lot of, SCVMM users. Some people are using Hyper-V Manager. Doesn't really seem that we have a lot of people who are using Hyper-V primarily here, but we'll kind of leave the poll open for just a couple of minutes. Wow, SCOM is not getting any points here, folks. So anyway, we're going to leave this open for just a few more seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. All right, and we are closed. I'll share the results with everybody. So, wow, okay. So it seems like on the call, there is a lot of usage of SCVMM, and there's a lot of usage of Hyper-V managers. There's some PowerShell in there, and we got some Five9 manager people in here. So that's great. Thank you so much. We'll talk a little bit later about, some complications of, the tools and the reasons why you moved from VMware to Hyper-V in the first place. But with that, thanks so much for the information, and I hope this is enlightening for everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. And those were interesting results. I'll have to look at those again.
Yeah.
So another requirement is you need a management VM. You need essentially a VM that will hold the SCVMM instance, and then obviously a SQL server. Typically, you can run it as long as you size it properly on the same server as SCVMM, and that stores all the data relating to managing virtual machines. But best practices for Microsoft does recommend separating those two functions, and especially if you have an enterprise environment of like 200 to 300 plus VMs, etc. So that's what's important around having a management VM. And the management VM does other things. Obviously, it manages obviously the entire virtualization, infrastructure, etc. So let me move on here. So other requirements for a data center environment that you would need for Hyper-V is a SCOM instance. You need something to monitor what's going on. You need to track VM health. And not just seeing if it's up and down, performance-related issues, how the load is doing. Are we undersubscribing or oversubscribing the load, etc. So, which is really, really important. So planning. There are a lot of important questions to ask, especially if you're a consultant with a customer, or you're an IT consultant or an IT professional in your own environment. There are a lot of things that you have prep work, and there's a lot of things you need to ask yourself or to the customer. Are you going to be using existing hardware, and what is the end of life on that hardware? Or are you using new hardware? And what technology are you using in that hardware? Are you using a traditional SAN? Are you using SSDs? Are you using hyperconverged technologies like S2D? How many VMs am I migrating over? And how many am I staying in the existing environment because I have maybe a legacy application that depends on that environment? Do I know which VMs are a part of which workloads? Do I understand the really application awareness of what's going on? For example, Exchange in a large enterprise can be a very large multi-rolled environment and separated into lots of different pieces. So you have to understand, do you understand the entire workload? How much downtime will my migration require? Can I actually live migrate it or not? And how will that fit in with my, with production, and what's going to happen, with the impact to production? So those are a lot of the important questions to ask yourself, before, really getting into an endeavor like this. And then you're talking about pre-migration cleanup. When you're ready to start going down the road of moving from VMware to Hyper-V, there's a lot of little cleanup you have to do to make a successful migration. So for example, and I think a lot of admins can understand some of this stuff, especially if you're doing vMotions now with VMware, is that you want to remove all the attached CD-ROMs and floppies. You want to remove all VMs of all unnecessary hardware, because something could be potentially uncompatible, and you could obviously add that hardware in that is obviously the equivalent, and once you move that migration over there. You also want to clean up those disks. You want to make sure that they're as efficient and as clean as possible. And so we can consolidate those disks. And then you want to commit all your snapshots. You want to make sure those are all committed, so before you actually do a migration. So migration, what's your options? So when you're going from HyperV to SCVMM, you've got a couple options. You can use the built-in SCVMM tools. Again, they're very limited and especially complex workloads. They're error-prone, and they're meant for ideal VMs and ideal workloads. Specifically, and Microsoft might crucify me for this, but like SQL Server and workloads that tend to be around the Microsoft space. So it's not for, we'll say, erratic workloads, etc. It's not a very, not a very, we'll say, a good tool for understanding those type of workloads. So that's one way we can do it, is using that tool. And then we have our tool. We have, 5.9 B2V Easy Converter. It has very low requirements, server 2008 or above. Has a very low margin for error. It's all wizard based. Unless you can't click a VM and hit next, 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 and choose where you're going to put something, then can't make it easier than that. And it can exclude things that may not be compatible. Maybe a piece of hardware or something else of that nature that you're being brought over to that environment. So again, it's a great tool to essentially bring over migration of that VMware environment to Hyper-V. And just as a side note, the big move to where I've been seeing from VMware to other hypervisors like Hyper-V is really around this VTAX, which I like to call, and I know VMware would hate me to call it that, but it's an expensive product, and it's one of those products that definitely has a very nice UI, but we're at the point that we have a much, we have other products that definitely have UIs that are just as better, if not better, than the vCenter UIs. So, like example, 5.9 Manager.
Hey, Rob.
Yes.
As long as we're here and we're on the topic of migration, we've got another poll question here.
Sure.
And it's I'm going to put it up right now for everybody.
Awesome.
If you recently migrated or are considering migrating from VMware to Hyper-V, what is the reason? So just help us understand. Is it the cost? Is it that you're getting Microsoft incentives? VMware fatigue? Is it that there's feature parity now? Go ahead and quickly fill this out, and we'll report back, because one of the reasons, and what's interesting for us as a software vendor in kind of the Microsoft cloud space, is it's really important to understand why people are shifting to the Microsoft cloud, so that we can build products and solutions that are tailored to each of you. All right, we'll leave the poll up for about 10 more seconds. Okay. We'll do our T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we are closing the poll. All right, and I'll go ahead and share results. So here, this is from all of your different colleagues here. A lot of people are saying that they're moving to Hyper-V and the Microsoft and cloud environments because of the increasing costs. And
pretty much what I said.
Yeah, I mean, so this is exactly what you said, but it seems like Hyper-V and VMware, there's a lot of parity between the two, and Microsoft is getting incentives, people to move. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks everybody for filling that out, and Rob, I'll let you take this away from here.
Absolutely, and that poll was great to really emphasize my point, is increasing costs. And we are close to feature parity at this point, and it really, between hypervisors, it's really a numbers game at this point, and hypervisors have become more of a commodity. So let's get started on the next part of this. Cleanup. So once you've done this migration, you need to clean up your migration source within VMware. So You know, there's things like you got to remove anything that was not removed by the API. So, for example, phantom disks, phantom VMs potentially. There are other instances, but you get the gist of that. You want to also ensure that all VMs that are copied are disabled, shut down, and killed. Because as all of us notice, if we have an instance running with the same IP, we'll have an IP conflict, and then nobody's up. So very, very important to make sure that infrastructure on the source side is actually shut down, killed, and disabled. Very important. So other things to do on the cleanup is you got to perform an analysis on your VMs within HyperV and SCOM. You really need to understand, you know, what the processing resources and memory resources and storage resources. And like I mentioned before, are you oversubscribing, you know, resources? Are you undersubscribing? Again, those have different abilities. Undersubscribing can obviously lead to performance increases, decreases, versus oversubscribing versus, you know, versus you're not getting as much out of your hardware, bang for your buck, as you would typically would, so you can't get as much density. So, you know, there are a lot of things to take into account. You know, you want to definitely review each application because they're absolutely going to have different requirements. And then you have to use SCOM with a management pack to trend out each of these virtualization workloads. You know, there's a lot of SCOM management packs like for SQL, for Exchange, a lot of third-party management packs, etc. And then you have to essentially also do SCVMM tuning. And that's essentially going through SCVMM and tuning out what your different settings are, how you want things to behave when something goes down, et cetera, et cetera. And that's obviously a combination of SCVMM and also Failover Cluster Manager. And then again, you have to go through testing these instances, making sure that these are fully functional, that they are performing like they were performing in the previous environment, if not better. So HyperV deployment. So this is a fun topic. So let me go on this. So first thing you need to do, once you've deployed your HyperV nodes, and these are individual HyperV nodes, is you essentially build a failover cluster. And you install the Failover Cluster Manager, which is a native tool that you install with the Add Roles and Features wizard. And this is where, you know, once you've installed that tool, you have to have a requirement of 3 or more hosts. 4 is recommended for full parity. And also, you want to, you also have to understand if they're going to require disk controllers or adapters that will tie into the failover cluster, like SAS or Fiber Channel over Ethernet or iSCSI, or even S2D. So that presents it as SMB, I believe. So you have to understand, you know, those type of technologies and what the requirements are on that. Again, so building out a clustered instance of HyperV, you know, you want to make it as simple as going into each VM and right-clicking and making it highly available. And that, you know, that's essentially what you do that. But it's, again, a different tool. You have to use Failover Cluster Manager to actually do that function, and it's not done in Virtual Machine Manager, which you would think it would. This also, so what happens when you do that and you make it highly available, it makes copies of the metadata on the host, and then it provides an automatic restart on the other host if you have a failure on the primary host. So that's essentially how the high availability function works.
And do I have to make sure that we have permissions for both of the different tools? How does that work, Rob? That's a question.
Yep, you have to have, yes, there are a couple roles that are within Active Directory if it's domain-based. And there are a couple roles if you're doing a single, most clusters are in domain-based AD environments, but even in single roles. And there are roles like cluster admins, HyperV admins, etc., that you have to be part of. And then also, by default, you also need to be part of domain admins, which gives you a lot of permissions around clustering, groups, etc. But again, when you're migrating these tools, you definitely want to lock down to what permissions you need, not to what permissions you think that would open it up to the world, because it can be very dangerous to have more permissions than you need.
So,
uh,
Rob, so
sure.
in your time consulting and with the customers that you've talked to, well, tell me about how opening up these multiple tools kind of plays into human error or different things that could happen in the environment if people aren't careful.
Correct. Yeah. So error prone. It comes down to it's a lot of confusion between the tools. A lot of people are not sure which tool to go to. Sometimes even experienced admins. There's error prone, especially if you have over permissions on a particular tool. Not particularly rated, but another System Center product. I had a customer about 6-7 years ago right click on an entire HyperV node set and say reimage, and they had the permissions to do that. It wiped the entire cluster. So again, you
Yikes.
got to be yeah. So there are a lot of things that you have to take into account, and understanding permissions and really locking it down to where it needs to be. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, awesome. So high availability, actually, as I mentioned before, to bring in high availability, you need to install Failover Cluster Manager, which actually is very complex. It's disaggregated and it's generally unstable to an extent. And I would say that more often than most. The tool it works independently of SCVMM, and again, you use it independently of also HyperV Manager. So there's also a lot of margin for error being that disaggregated. So what's an option tool? You can use Windows PowerShell, but that requires some really deep knowledge of PowerShell language and understanding how to do all these different cluster commands, migration commands, etc. So that would be very cumbersome for especially a new virtualization admin or even a VMware admin coming over to Hyper-V, especially if you're not familiar with PowerShell. So again, that's a very difficult option and requires deep scripting knowledge. Number 3, us. Use Five9 Manager. We have a very simple UI. Gives us the ability to really dive down into some of those analytics and understanding where our high availability is. Are we actually performing at high availability? Are there predictive failures that are going to be coming down the line, etc.? So, there are a lot of metrics that we're recording. And again, this is a very simple UI. Versus if you look at the SCOM UI, and I don't have a screenshot here, the SCOM UI, and if anybody's ever seen it, is a very complex UI. And then within each of these ribbon or tabs on the side has a lot more complexity in that. Here we're giving you a lot, giving you exactly what you need, etc. So another part of high availability is HyperV Networking, and that consists of 2 parts. So we have the virtual switch part where you have essentially an external virtual switch. You have an internal virtual switch, and then you have a private virtual switch. They have different distinctions where the private is internal to the into the switch itself, versus internal could be within the virtualization network, and then you have external where you're tying into a production network. Then you have virtual network adapters, and you have Hyper-V specific adapters, and this is important because you have something called Gen 1 and Gen 2 VMs. Gen 1 is the essentially first generation of VMs that had, we'll say, limited hardware support, and Gen 2 VMs have a lot more, we'll say, hardware support, extended support for Linux, Windows 2016, etc. So there's actual network adapters that are specific to those Gen 1 or Gen 2 VMs. And then also you have legacy network adapters, which are essentially Gen 1 VMs. Those are usually really older VMs, especially if you're building out on existing hardware technology that you may have in-house. Oh, let me move back here one more time. And also part of high availability, and as you can see in the diagram here, is that we typically, and it depends on the environment, but you typically are putting a cluster, especially maybe we'll say a 3 or 4 node cluster, onto maybe a 240 gig network cards. That way you can actually perform RDMA, which is a great technology that Microsoft is really taking on. And we can talk about it. That has a whole other discussion on it. But again, you know, other environments, depending on the SMB, you can also do dual 100 gig environments. You know, you can aggregate that bandwidth. You can dedicate one bandwidth to live migration, and then other bandwidth to production workload, etc. It depends on your application needs. And then I got some people that just make one VLAN, and because they don't need, they can survive with all that traffic on one VLAN. So, and it's important. We want to match all those networking requirements on both sides, such as, you know, the production network. And as I mentioned before, people separate these networks mainly because you don't want as much traffic on one VLAN versus another. You know, for example, VoIP networks tend to be very noisy, so you want to make sure that you're matching those networks and you're matching those VLANs so you have an easy transition. Because a lot of VoIP phones are talking to a voice over IP virtual machine that's basically their phone system. So again, you were segmenting that out. And then you have a management network where essentially you basically having very light traffic. You're not being interrupted by, you know, a VoIP network or a production network that may have a lot of high traffic. And it gives you that ability to really have a consistent, very high performing experience when you're managing that environment. So the other things that are important is you want to make sure all VMs are in the proper network. So when you migrate those over, are they in the right VLAN? If they're not in the right VLAN, you're not going to see that thing show up in the production network. Also, you want to make sure you can successfully communicate, route, or not route between networks. You know, what's important. You know, in some cases, you may be going from one VLAN to another, and you want to essentially route between the networks. And maybe you're having a forwarding page on the old application to a new application. So you want to make sure you can communicate between those networks, or if in a security fashion, maybe not route between those networks. So live migration. Live migration is analogous with live vMotion. It's the same function, where essentially you can move a machine live without taking down any downtime. And essentially you want to build out that live migration network. Typically, as a rule of thumb, even if you have a small environment, live migration should always have a dedicated network, in my opinion. Because of the amount of traffic, and you don't want any hiccups during a live migration between one node to another, especially if it's any kind of high transactional application workload running on those VMs. So testing live migration once you've built it is important. You want to be able to move those workloads on the fly. For example, during maybe patch or upgrade cycles or upgrade of existing hardware, maybe you're moving it over to another node and then you upgrade that hardware and then you move it back. So again, you will have zero downtimes during upgrades, which is really important. Back in my day, in the consultant days, I had a customer, and when we were testing out live migration, we would essentially run streaming video on YouTube in a couple different, 4 different channels, and then live migrate and watch that machine and see if there's any hiccups along the way, which is a really neat way to kind of see how that was, how that live migration would have no, we'll say, hiccups in the migration of that production of that application. And so it was a really neat way to do it. Not that I'm telling you to use YouTube or one of those type of mediums, but there's always ways to make sure an application is functioning when you're actually moving it. So templates and libraries. These are important, essentially. You want to, they're important because templates give you the ability to essentially build out, modernized versions of 2016 or modernized applications of other OS applications. And then when you need to essentially build some agility or scale out, you essentially can build these things on the fly with everything pre-installed. And for example, in Exchange, mailbox servers are easier to migrate while hub transport servers are easier to rebuild. And that's actually a true case. Let me explain why that is. Mailbox servers are holding real data, real data, the actual mailbox data. Hub transport servers really are all they are doing is passing email as a separate role on a separate VM and flagging things that are maybe potentially spam or malware, virus, etc. And all it's holding for data is logs. So again, you can see that's one VM you can rebuild. It's not worth actually migrating that VM. It's a lot easier to rebuild it. And the other thing is the only thing you'd want to be capturing on that is the logs. But typically, a lot of Exchange admins are shooting their logs to some kind of central log management solution. So the average life cycle for a VM, and I know a lot of admins do not hear by this, but it's very, very, very important, is about a year. Because what ends up happening is with application patching, with Windows patching, with installing runtimes, within temp files, just all sorts of things, combinations of those things, you start getting something called OS drag. And that drag starts really hitting in around 6 to 8 months. So again, very important, try to, re-provision those VMs for at least once a year so you can actually understand, bring up that performance. This is especially prevalent in GUI environments. So let's move on here a little bit more about templates and PMs. They help reduce the workload associated manually rebuilding VMs every year. Templates, you can convert VMs into templates anytime for later use, so you can build that up, get it exactly the way you like it, convert it to a template, you're ready to roll. You can even clone and reuse VMs from templates, which is awesome. Libraries essentially are the place where we're storing those VM templates. Oops, next slide. So we're into Hyper-V management and best practices. So let's talk about a little bit more. Oh, I think this is a duplicate slide.
Do we have a boo-boo in there?
Yeah, that's a duplicate
that's
slide.
how you know it's live, folks. I put this in here to test them.
Nice. All right. Let's talk about this a little bit. Production, consumption, and monitoring. So what does production mean? That means you're bringing that actual environment, that clustered environment into production. And it's ready to go, and we're ready to start application workloads. And we have those application workloads spinned up, and we're just waiting for those users to come in. And that's where consumption comes in. And it's important. Consumption is the very first time your end user is going to hit that environment, and they're going to understand what that performance is like. So, part of those phasing is understanding consumption really needs to be, a very important part of this, because when you bring that thing to production and consumption, the perception is that's what it's going to act like the entire time when that application is running. So let's move on to monitoring a little bit. And monitoring is important because you also have to understand the performance of those tools, performance of how this workloads are going. So let me explain a little bit about production, consumption, and monitoring in terms of with SCVMM. So admins typically will use SCVMM. It has very light permissions on it. SCVMM is tenant-based, has self-service, it allocates admins, allows to allocate admins to basically carve up CPU, memory, and storage between the different tenants. So either in an SI situation, service provider, provider situation, or even internal where you're provisioning tools for maybe DevOps and different teams within IT. And you got to realize with Microsoft these are disparate tools. You have to use different tools like HyperV Manager. You have to that essentially creates virtual switches to an extent. SCVMM, which does a little bit more part of the networking part, but also adds a little bit more capabilities with snapshots, etc. And then you have to use SCOM for the monitoring and transactional monitoring, etc. So it basically puts a lot of disaggregated tools and a lot of confusion between those tool sets. So, and I just talked about that. So let's talk about 5.9 Manager Data Center.
Hey, and before
And
we begin that, Rob, I've got
oh,
one last
no
poll.
problem.
Yeah, I've got one last poll question before we show you kind of how Five9 Brand Manager brings all of these different functions and operations that VMware administrators have to go through when they move to Hyper-V or are managing Hyper-V. So that being said, let's talk about your current tools. Tell us, how satisfied are you with SCVMM or Hyper-V Manager? Are you very satisfied? Are you somewhat satisfied? Help kind of give us an understanding of where you are in your general life cycle. All right. We'll give this just a few more seconds here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And really what it tells us is that, people are pretty, okay with what's going on here now, SCVM or Hyper-V Manager. So I think that that's a great opportunity, because I think what Rob's going to show you next is really going to make you change possibly the way that you're looking at Hyper-V today and how you're managing it, and possibly make it a lot easier. So thank you for that, everybody. And with that, Rob, I'll kick it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. So let's get the poll off the screen here. Awesome. So let's talk about this. Advance. Here we go. So what sets Five9 apart from SCVMM? So we have unified cloud management, which is really important to be able to manage heterogeneous environments. We have a simple deployment and configuration, very wizard-based, very simple deployment. We have advanced virtualization security that's on top of Hyper-V already. We have built-in backup and recovery, which is great because you want to have the ability to have that within the same product scheme and not use another product. We have replication. We built, like a Hyper-V replication between sites, and we do that in a very simple fashion. And the TCO on this is very, very competitive with SCVMM. Brian, do you happen to know the TCO offhand?
I don't, but I know that we've saved several customers, 75%, time savings, and if you just kind of multiply that, out over an extended period of time, that the numbers get pretty high.
Understood. Yeah, that's about what I would say. Let's see here. Let's move on to the next slide here. Awesome. So we're going to talk about Five9 Manager Data Center 2.0 and a demonstration. By the way, we actually have 2.1 right around the corner, which is adding some more enhanced feature sets. But let's get into this demo now. All right. So as you can see here, Ryan, does everybody see my screen?
I can see the dark gray screen. You pull up your lab. Oh, there we go. Now I see it.
Awesome. So just as an FYI, this is actually our labs. If you go to our website under resources, there's actually a lab you can actually run through and play with the entire Five9 Manager console with a real cluster. You can start VMs, etc. But let me actually walk you through it here a little bit. So all right. So as you can see here, we have nodes here, and as you can see that there are 2 nodes in this particular cluster. Yes, I always say 3, but for demo purposes, we have 2 nodes in this cluster. And as you can see, this is the entire cluster here. This one actually doesn't have any VMs on it. And if I wanted to, I could obviously do typical functions that you do in VMware, like move, virtual machine, or if you just want to move the virtual storage over to another data store, etc. You can do that, which is a common activity if you're consolidating or to a different SAN, etc. And as you can see, it's all very wizard-based, etc. And here you can select the store that you want to go to. And you can say, okay, allow the virtual machine files to be individually placed within the same storage, and that's that if you want to do that, or if you want them on different storage, etc. That's more about segmentation of certain types of data. And then again, where do you want those VHD disks? Do you want them automatically placed, etc.? So everything's very wizard-based. There's not a lot of effort involved in moving virtual machines or live migrating them. Creating virtual machines, again, is another wizard-based function, very easy to use. Are we going to create a new virtual machine, or are we going to go from a template? And where does that template reside? Oh, it resides in this data store, and all of a sudden we can actually look at some of the drop downs here, and there's Windows 2016. We can do a Windows 2016 deployment. We can also obviously put in all the variables for staging, so like the computer name, local administrator password, product key, so that's slipstream in, and then obviously time dated, so it can be deployed and ready for production in short order. So really important, as you can see, when you go through the wizard, you're adding all the different types of things, for example, processors, memory, networking adapters, etc. So what's great on that also is that if you're a tenant in this situation, you're only going to be limited to essentially the resources that you have access to. So again, these are all the common functions. Checkpoints, just FYI, they are the equivalent to snapshots in VMware. So if you want to checkpoint a particular VM that's highlighted, you can click on it. It's already checkpointed. At that point, you can go return to that checkpoint if you wanted to, etc. Or snapshot and revert back. Again, these are all the similar functions. We've tried to make the UI as easy as possible, especially for VMware administrators coming over, because they're used to that really high UX interaction. And that's what we're really striving for in our product. This is where you'd actually manage data stores, whether there are CSV data stores, SMB, presented shares, or even iSCSI, for example. So again, this is where you manage the data stores, etc. Now this is where it gets interesting. Monitoring. Now I showed you Hyper-V management. Whoops, sorry about that. Let's see if there we go. I showed you Hyper-V management, and I showed you all these different things you can do in here, and also virtual switches, where you're building virtual switches, and even SDN management, which is software-defined networking. This would typically take 3 tools and a lot more time if you're using native Microsoft tools. Now, that's just on the Hyper-V tab. Now, monitoring. Monitoring is obviously very important, and I talked about previously monitoring in Microsoft land is using SCOM. And SCOM is a very complex tool. It typically requires a dedicated admin if you really want to get full use out of that tool, versus we have an all-in-one solution where the tool we basically have monitoring built into our tool sets. We make it very simple to configure your alerting and thresholds, and then I guess and again we're also having real-time alerting, real-time statuses on our environment, like our virtual machine health and our host health, what's going on there. And exactly what does our cluster look like, and how many nodes are in that cluster, and how many data stores, etc. All the really great stats, and then obviously storage capacity free, etc. So again, a great dashboard for understanding a lot of that stuff. And then also you can configure dynamic optimization, which SCOM does, but it's a lot more complex, meaning optimizing your VM workloads and balancing them between the nodes. So next thing up is backup that we have built in. Again, all-in-one solution. And again, we have built-in backup, so you can create a backup through a wizard-based backup. Currently, we support Azure backup, so you can go through here. Do you want to encrypt it with your own key? Do you want to use compression? What type of compression and what block size do you want to do it in? And those are obviously depending on the workload and the type of data that you were obviously compressing. Do you want to actually protect the entire cluster or individual VMs within the cluster? Let me pull that out here. And then again, where's the data store? And next is, where are we backing up? We're going to back up. Now, by the way, When you back up, that's selecting storage for backup locally. Now we're talking about backing up to the cloud. Now, if you remember, I only selected one VM, but now you can go in here and also be detailed. You may only want to back up all VMs here and then maybe selected VMs on the backup to the cloud. And then this is where you set all your variables where you get in the Azure portal, like your account name and your actual account key that provides you credentials into your instance of Azure Cloud and your blob instances. So once you've gone through that, and you'll notice that if I don't have an account name, it won't let me go through. But the next parts of this is, you'd have your schedule on this, how often do you want to run this, do you want to make this a template, and also your retention settings. How long you want to keep those VMs, 7 days. Do you want to keep monthlies and 1 monthlies and then have full weeklies? There's obviously the different backup schemas depending on your workload and application. So that's actually what you do in the backup stuff, and this is where also in this tab you can also see the archives and of all the backups on Azure and even locally. So really great way to understand what's going on. This is typically done in Data Protection Manager. And so again, something that's all built into our tool. You don't have, it's a single pane of glass, and you can it's very simplified management and restore and delete functions, etc. So next and final is we have our administration functions, and this is where you essentially add your users, whether they're global administrator users or your tenants. They can either be individual, their own, we'll say, individual user database stored in SQL, or they can be use AD integrated users. It could go either way. It depends on the situation, tenant environment. Also, upcoming, we're going to also have multi-domain AD support. So again, this is where you'd set all those type of parameters, also RBAC controls, etc. So that is our tool in a nutshell. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, Ryan. Is that right?
We are, but I think if you're finished with your demo, Rob, we could probably kick it off to some questions. So if you want to throw up just kind of like the thank you screen. So for those of you who have to leave, please go ahead. But for those of you who can stick around for questions, we'd love to talk to you. Just go ahead and there's a question section in the go to webinar console, and we'll go ahead and ask those. So there's a few different questions that came in. One of them is which, I have multiple sites. Would Five9 Manager work for me?
Yes. Yes, it would. We essentially would manage those multiple sites and within the hierarchy. If you noticed, we had a hierarchy of different clusters, etc. So we'd actually have a hierarchy of the different sites. Obviously, you have to have connectivity to those sites, whether it's VPN, site-to-site VPN, or MPLS, or etc. But yes, we do support that.
Okay. Another question came in asking, I'm a hosting provider with multiple customers in using Hyper-V. Can I manage customers' instances with Five9 Manager?
Can I manage customer instances, VM instances with Five9 Manager?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes, because you have total control over your tenants. Yep.
Okay, another question came in, and I can answer this one. We have a customer actually on the line. Thank you very much. Who's using a Five9 Manager with antivirus, but they're not familiar with the GUI that we were showing today. So we were actually showing our Five9 Manager data center product today. That's our flagship, enterprise grade Five9 Manager product. If you're using Five9 Manager with antivirus, you're on the standard. So if you're interested in seeing or trialing the Five9 Manager data center product, please reach out to your account executive. We've got another question in. Does the monitoring, Rob, does the monitoring in Five9 Manager give the kind of details on performance kind of details on performance, examples, data store latencies that are available in vCenter.
Yes, yes. Well, we can actually, I might have a screenshot of that. Give me a moment. Yes, it does. That's the short answer. The long answer is I can bring up a picture's 1,000 words. Oops. There we go. So the question was, can we look at certain statistics? So we have capacity settings here. We can actually go into, let me get in here. So we can look at latency settings, but we have to set thresholds. And then basically they would show up as alerts. Does that make sense?
I think so. And for the gentleman who asked that question, if you have any follow-ups, please reach out to your account executive. I've got another question that came in, and Rob, maybe you can answer this. Does this change the licensing needed? I'm looking at data center with SCCM licensing to get access to the VMM and whatnot. Would I be able to just have data center licensing with this minus the SCCM add-on license?
The data center license is required because of the clustering capabilities. That's just a requirement on Microsoft side. On the there are certain requirements that we have. We still would have requirements on if you get SCVMM, great, because SCCM, I'm sorry, because SCVMM will come along with it. We do depend on some of API within the SCVMM, but that's going away in short order. So.
Okay, Rob. Well, you know what? We're 5 after the hour. That wraps up the webinar. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to sales@five9.com or go to five9.com and you can actually trial Data Center for yourself, free for 14 days. Otherwise, we'll shortly follow up this webinar with a recording. And next week's webinar, we are going to be covering best practices for SCVMM. So if you're looking into a little more SCVMM specific related information, we are going to actually send a webinar invitation for next week. So we hope you'll join. Thank you everybody for joining today's session. Thank you, Rob, for being such a great presenter, and we'll talk to everybody shortly.
Great, Ryan. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.